When you are rooted in self-trust and you are in a healthy, connected relationship with yourself, which is what this entire podcast is here to help you facilitate, you can protect yourself in relationships and stay in connection, and in connection that meets your needs. And if that feels so foreign and so far away, I want you to think that right now that might not be accessible to you, but the universe is either a place of lack or a place of abundance. Every time I think it's a place of lack, I'm in a spiritual disconnect. I forgot that this place is a place of abundance. So you might not have access to it right now, but you will and can have access to that in the future. Welcome to Grow with Robin Breckenridge, a podcast about stepping into the most fully expressed, aligned, and conscious version of yourself. Here, we dive into the real work of personal growth, establishing boundaries, understanding your patterns, building self-trust, healing emotional wounds, and creating relationships that feel safe, authentic, and fulfilling. I'm Robin, a life and relationship coach, and in each episode, we'll explore the tools, insights, and conversations that will help you not just improve your life and relationships, but truly transform them. You don't have to just go through it. Let's grow through it, and let's do it together. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Grow with Robin. Last week, we talked about anxious attachment, and boy, did I hear from some of you guys. I got text messages, I got emails, and for some of you guys, that episode really landed. And for some of you, you might be thinking, that's not me. I'm not the one doing the chasing and fighting for the connection in the relationship. I'm the one pulling away. And this episode is for you. Because where anxious attachment fears abandonment, avoidant attachment fears engulfment. And when I say engulfment, I mean this: the fear of being overwhelmed, consumed, controlled, losing your autonomy, losing your agency, losing your sense of self inside someone else's needs, emotions, expectations, the list goes on and on. So one attachment style moves towards connection in order to avoid being left. The other attachment style, which is an avoidant attachment style that we're talking about today, moves away from connection to avoid being swallowed. And in both attachment styles are two people trying to survive something they once couldn't control, which means that we all have inner children that have experienced things and we truly were powerless and alone in them. We couldn't make our caregivers more emotionally available or teach them how to have boundaries within the relationship with us. So today we're going to talk about the nervous system that learned closeness isn't safe, that getting too close is the threat. So remember that when our attachment styles or systems kick in, it means we're activated. We don't just walk around that way. There's something about whatever is around you that doesn't feel safe. And keep in mind, everything is a relationship. So you're not just avoidant in your relationships. You might be avoidant to money. You might be avoidant in your relationship to food. You might be like, I'm just going to eat this. I'm not going to worry about what it's going to do to me later, whatever. But this is in any relationship in your life. So yes, you can be avoidant and still have friends and still have relationships. It's just, there's a high likelihood you're not letting people in close enough because closeness once felt unsafe. And there's a high likelihood that it repeatedly felt unsafe in your relationships growing up. So closeness could equal to a threat to your autonomy, you being your own individual person in a relationship, a threat to your agency. Agency means you having the ability to make choices for yourself, a threat to who you are. So where anxious attachment fights for connection, avoidant attachment survives by protecting itself from it. You don't lean in. You pull back. You create space. you disappear emotionally or physically. This is the flight response of attachment. When we go back to those 4Fs, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, this is there's a lion in the woods. I saw it and I am taking off and creating some distance between me and that threat in order to stay alive. So you don't have a flight response because you don't care. Now, this is where people who operate in an avoidant attachment wound get a bad rap, because when you're in relationship with it, it doesn't feel like the other person's doing a whole lot of feeling or that they don't care. But you are not fleeing because you don't care. You're fleeing because closeness once meant losing yourself. Now, I've been transparent. Last episode, I talked a lot. I even giggled in the episode about my own anxious attachment. Well, lucky me, I have an anxious attachment and an avoidant attachment. I've always hit the lottery in random places. So what does that mean? It means that I have an ambivalent attachment. Next week, we're going to talk about ambivalent attachment. I'll probably do some giggling or crying in that one too. But I want you to hear that if you're listening to this, when we start to get into the kind of criteria and behaviors that make up an avoidant attachment, it just means that you've had an experience with both. And that depending on what energy you are around or in relationship will depend on which attachment system kicks up to keep you safe. So in my own experience, my anxious attachment was a lot louder than my avoidant attachment. And once I started working on my anxious attachment and started creating more safe relationships, started implementing more boundaries and protecting myself from rejection, abandonment, and neglect, then it was like the next piece of work illuminated and my avoidant attachment came up. And it was a lot sneakier for me to find. It was definitely not as loud, but it was fiercely protective in a very maladaptive way. And it kept me from feeling known and seen in my relationships. So I know that in the beginning of this type of work that I did, I used to think, man, avoidance got it easy. Ooh, they don't care about anything. They don't feel anything. Because I have experienced every type of attachment style, I don't think there is anyone that is worse, just different. And they are all maladaptive protectors that come on board when a threat is present in our environment or in the story we're telling ourselves. And all of them deserve to be looked at, because when we shift into our attachment system, we are in a state of disconnect. Sometimes we are disconnecting from ourselves. Sometimes we're disconnecting from others. Sometimes we're doing both. And we are hardwired for connection. We came here programmed to connect with other people and things. So staying in these attachment styles, having them come up as the maladaptive protectors, there is just another way of living that is more connected and creates a more aligned life. So if you identify with an avoidant attachment style being your default, you're not screwed. And if I can heal these things, if I can actively work on them, anyone can. I truly, truly, truly mean that. I know I have a specific set of skills in this lane of work, but I am as much of a human as anyone else. That's why I don't call myself an expert. I am working on attachment just as much as you guys are. I'm working on boundaries. I'm working on self-care. I think one thing that separates me a little bit is that I just have the ability to dust off and try again. And that's what I'm imparting to you guys. So one way to dust off and be able to try again or shift into a healthier attachment system, like a secure attachment, is knowing when your attachment systems flare up. So let's talk about an avoidant attachment. I like to nickname them because it just kind of encompasses what's going on in that attachment system. I call an avoidant attachment the distancer. And that's not a judgment. Again, that's just a high level that like, oh yeah, this is the attachment style that needs distance in order to feel safe and regulated. So in an avoidant attachment, your nervous system learns if I stay separate or if there is distance, I am safer. Distance becomes protection and independence becomes armor. So let's talk about the origin of an avoidant attachment. Now, there are lots of different approaches to attachment. Mine might not be the same as every book you read, as other people who specialize in attachment. I am just being honest. I have been reading people's nervous systems for 10 years. This is what makes the most sense. It's also what my intuition directs me to and feels very aligned with. So please feel free to learn more about attachment and learn different approaches to it. This is what makes the most sense to me. I believe that an avoidant attachment, the origin of it is enmeshment. Now, I know we've all heard the term enmeshment. I remember being in therapy and hearing that word come up often in my own work and kind of nodding my head, but never really understanding like what exactly does it mean. So enmeshment is a relationship dynamic where there are no clear emotional boundaries between two people. It's when your feelings become my responsibility. My mood determines your safety. Your choices are filtered through my expectations. Individuality feels like betrayal. And in enmeshment, separation isn't encouraged. It's subtly punished, or it is just not allowed. So that means you don't get to fully develop your own voice, your own knowing, your own preferences, or your own emotional independence. Because the relationship doesn't allow for healthy individuation. Now, let's talk about individuation for a second. There is a stage of development. It happens in our teenage years and in our early adulthood, where we are in a state of individuation. It means we are starting to become our own person. We're starting to separate from the family system. Now, that is healthy because family systems, we are there as parents to facilitate the person that we incarnated into this world for them to be their own person and the most fully expressed version of them, not an extension of us. Now, I know that sometimes this can conflict with cultural beliefs. This can conflict with religious beliefs. So hear me out, just information, all information that you can just lean into. But healthy individuation happens at that time of our life. We dethrone our parents. We look at them as humans, less as deities. We see them as humans that are flawed. Like you might go, okay, she told me to do this, but I see how she's handling her friendships. I don't really trust that. And we start to build our own sense of self. So individuation, if there's a healthy family system, is not a threat. It might create grief within the parent. I was on a podcast years ago where we were talking about parenting. It happened to be a parenting podcast or a family podcast. And I explained that I believe that parenting is a journey through grief. Now, that's not to put a dark cloud on it. My gosh, there's so many beautiful things about parenting. But what happens is we bring a child into this world, we pretty much create it as a main focus in our life, and then it leaves us. It leaves the nest. And I don't think that, a lot of us are exposed to information of how to healthily manage grief in general, healthily manage grief in parenting. And of course, it activates all of the unhealed wounding that we have within ourselves. So healthy individuation is healthy. We don't have to rebel. We don't have to fight for our autonomy. We are met where we are. So a relationship that doesn't allow for healthy differentiation or healthy individuation is an enmeshed relationship. So that does not mean there's an absence of connection or love or attention, like can happen in an anxious attachment. It means that there is too much and that there is not appropriate boundaries to protect the person who never consented to it. Because a child cannot consent to being an emotional support to you, to being an extension of you. They are merely trying to survive in their environment. So speaking of environments, avoidant attachment often forms in environments where a parent was controlling or micromanaging. A parent was critical or intrusive. You felt emotionally and or physically responsible for your parent growing up. You grew up under a microscope. You were engulfed by a parent's emotions, opinions, judgments, or needs. There were no appropriate boundaries between you and the caregiver. And that can mean you and the caregiver physically. That can mean you and the caregiver energetically. It could be that there isn't appropriate boundaries between you and your opinions and their opinions, their beliefs and your beliefs. And their energy became your environment. And because of that, you didn't get to develop a sense of autonomy, agency, a separate sense of self, and you couldn't be an individual within that dynamic. You couldn't choose based off of you and what was true for you, so you learned to adapt instead. At the heart of an avoidant attachment is the wound, if they get too close, I will lose myself, or get stuck or trapped. Like, I believe that on an emotional pain scale for people who identify with an avoidant attachment wound, feeling trapped is probably close to a 10. Now, for anxious attachment, being left, being rejected, being abandoned, being neglected, that would take you to a 9 or a 10. So what that ends up equating to in your body is love doesn't feel safe. Relationships don't feel safe. Commitment doesn't feel safe. Because connection in your early experiences did not feel mutual. It felt consuming. So your nervous system learned to adapt to that threat by guarding your autonomy at all costs. So that means that when you're in an avoidant attachment response, you are prioritizing self-protection over connection. And it's not because connection isn't wanted. It's because at some point in your life, connection felt dangerous. So how do we regulate when we are in an anxious attachment wound? We regulate by creating distance. When feelings start to amp up, someone has needs, sadness, vulnerability, desire, the system starts beeping. Pull away, back up, get back to safety. So regulation can look like emotional withdrawal, physical space, staying busy so that there is emotional space between you and your relationships. Numbing is a telltale sign of an avoidant attachment wound. Anytime I hear somebody numbing with their phone, with food, with drugs and alcohol, with people, because we can definitely numb with people as well, but you can numb with anything. That is a telltale sign that you are avoiding something. Intellectualizing instead of feeling is a telltale sign of an avoidant attachment wound. Hiding feelings, which is a really interesting one because we often hide feelings from other people. But what I've noticed in my own work and working with a lot of people is we will hide our feelings from ourselves. So a part of my individual work with people who are, actively in an avoidant attachment wound, or that's their default, is the first place is we stop hiding feelings from ourselves. We will avoid conflict in an avoidant attachment wound because we never learned how to have our voice. We were so enmeshed with someone else that conflict was not safe. Advocating for yourself was not safe. There was not appropriate boundaries in the relationship. So we tend to avoid it, often at all costs. But I do know that for some avoidance, which would be me included, it's almost like we hide it and we push it down. There's a great saying that I think goes with avoidance. You push it down, it comes out sideways. And sometimes we push it down, and then we can't keep the lid on it and we explode. So for some people that are in relationship with people who are more default avoidant, they might say conflict avoidant. What do you mean? Like, this person will blow on me, but they're blowing and it's coming out as rage because they have pushed it down for so long. So distance becomes the language we speak. So instead of saying this doesn't work for me, the body says it by leaving, disengaging, shutting down, or ghosting. So obviously boundaries are a huge part of the work that I teach and a huge part of being a relational conscious person in this world. So I want to talk about boundaries for a minute. And it's something that I didn't include in the episode about anxious attachment. So I'm going to throw a little anxious attachment in here. But an important distinction as far as like what kind of boundaries do we carry depending on our attachment style. It's very common that anxious attachment often has porous or weak boundaries because we are so much more focused on keeping the connection than protection that just kind of maths out, right? We will overextend, we'll overgive, we'll stay connected even though it's costing us our well-being. In avoidant attachment, it's really the opposite. Avoidant attachment often develops rigid boundaries. So when I'm talking to a group about boundaries or doing a workshop, there's always some people that really identify with like, holy smokes, I don't have any boundaries, or I'm really not practicing them. I'll have the occasional person in the room raise their hand and go like, I have great boundaries. I don't let anybody in on my life. I never over disclose. I never say yes when I don't mean it. And although some of that is great boundaries, some of it is also a rigid approach to having boundaries, which goes hand in hand with an avoidant attachment wound. And that is because they are prioritizing self-protection over the connection. So rigid boundaries can look like having walls instead of boundaries. So when I have those kind of clients that are like, oh my gosh, my boundaries are great, I don't even need to do this exercise with you. Often what's happening is that they have walls instead of boundaries. And hear me out. I'm a fan of walls when you grew up in a boundaryless environment. Do you know why? Because walls work. They keep people out. Problem is with walls, you're the only person behind the wall. And it becomes very isolating. You don't feel seen and known in your relationships. And once again, we have reactivated the trauma or the original trauma of feeling alone in the emotional challenge and experience. So walls are not the same as boundaries. Walls keep people out. Boundaries are limits that allow you to protect yourself and stay in connection with other people and yourself. It's why I freaking love boundaries. Not because I'm trying to run around this world being like, meh, I have boundaries. Because it is a healthy approach to relationships. And trust me, you guys, if you start applying them into your life, you will see how relevant they are and how eventually they lead you to a more flexible relational life. The healthier you are, the more flexible you are. Super rigid boundaries, which happen in the beginning when we're starting to set them because we're new, but when they continue to stay extremely rigid, it's probably not boundaries. They are probably walls, and there is probably a hurt part of you still maladaptively showing up to protect you. So boundaries are not walls. Rigid boundaries can also look like shutting down instead of speaking up, cutting off communication instead of repairing, withdrawing instead of expressing your needs, disappearing instead of setting a limit. And these aren't boundaries rooted in self-trust. And this level of rigidity in self-protection is not rooted in self-trust. They're rooted in self-protection. And I can tell you for sure, because I've lived it and I've watched so many people live it. When you are rooted in self-trust, and you are in a healthy, connected relationship with yourself, which is what this entire podcast is here to help you facilitate, you can protect yourself in relationships and stay in connection, and in connection that meets your needs. And if that feels so foreign and so far away, I want you to think that right now that might not be accessible to you, but the universe is either a place of lack or a place of abundance. Every time I think it's a place of lack, I'm in a spiritual disconnect. I forgot that this place is a place of abundance. So you might not have access to it right now, but you will and can have access to that in the future. So when we're in an avoidant attachment, those walls, those rigid boundaries become armor. And the armor says nothing gets in. Armor protects you from disappointment, intrusion, being overwhelmed. But armor also prevents closeness, intimacy, and truly being seen and witnessed, which I believe might be at the core of all of our wounding. So I say this from the bottom of my heart. If you grew up enmeshed where other people's needs, emotions, expectations, or judgments ran through you, distance felt like the only boundary available. And I do not fault you and I do not judge you, but we are not in the same environments we were growing up. Every second, the universe gives us another chance to choose. How do we shift out of these attachment styles, anxious and avoidant and ambivalent, and into secure? By choice. We remember that we have choice now. So no one taught you how to say no, how to ask for space without disappearing, how to disappoint people, how to impact people, how to have needs without being engulfed, how to be in relationship with people with healthy boundaries. So you learned the safest boundary is distance. So avoidant attachment isn't about not caring. It's about not knowing how to stay connected. It's about not knowing how to stay connected without the threat of losing yourself. So let me break down an avoidant attachment style in that think, feel, do model that we talked about last week with an anxious attachment style. So in an avoidant attachment, we think first. You analyze, you rationalize, you explain. You might think, this isn't that big of a deal. They're being dramatic. I just need space. There's other people out there with real problems. That's one I hear all the time. So you might think, and this can go both ways towards yourself or someone else, this isn't that big of a deal. You're being dramatic. Other people have it worse. And that is a way of intellectualizing your feelings. Thinking creates distance from the feeling. But what it means is that because you had some challenging feelings, I do not think there is a single human being that doesn't have feelings and that isn't experiencing the range of feelings we all do, because they are all alarms from our nervous system. Now, chronic states of experiencing a feeling like clinical depression, anxiety disorder, these type of things might be that some people are experiencing more often than others, but all of them are alarms from our nervous system of a need. So that means everyone has them. Now, what happens in attachment styles, even with anxious, is that we have a feeling in our body because that's where we experience it. And none of us are equipped to learn how to manage them or manage them in ways that help us in our life. That's what emotional intelligence really is. It means that we can use our feelings for tasks like thinking and problem solving. That means our feelings help us navigate this world, not that we need to detach or get rid of them or escape from them in order to function. So when I see people who live kind of neck up, is the way that I always describe it, in their head, it means their body is not safe. And when you have people who have obsessive compulsive thinking or rumination or get stuck in thought loops, what's happening is they are managing a feeling that they have no idea how to manage. They're shooting up into their head as a means to feel more control in that emotional experience and go somewhere familiar where you feel like you have more power. And anybody who has had repetitive thinking, obsessive compulsive thinking, anything like that, oh man, that's its own form of torture. You are not safer in your head. That's why a secure attachment integrates what you're thinking and feeling. And that's where we're going to in this work. We don't want to live just in our head. We don't want to live just in our feelings. Neither one of those is healthy. So what ends up happening in that think, feel, do model is in an avoidant attachment, we're processing everything through our thoughts. That's what we're connecting to first. And then we get into our action. So we think, we get into our action as a means to push down the feeling because we do not know how to manage and tolerate the feeling. So what does that look like? You get busy, you shut down, you go stop at the bar on the way home from work, or you open up a bottle of wine, you leave the room, you change the subject, you stop responding, you focus solely on work, you physically or emotionally withdraw. Now, here's what's tricky about avoidant attachment is that that's what's happening in your nervous system. But the people who are in relationship with someone who's experiencing an avoidant attachment wound, it really feels like they're thinking and doing and there's no feeling going on at all. When we're actually experiencing that wound, we do touch into a feeling. There's a lot of when our thoughts and feelings kind of bounce off each other, but we're touching into it for a nanosecond. And then we are getting into our action to push down that feeling. And what did I say earlier? You push it down, it comes out sideways. Now that might come out sideways in rage. That might come out sideways in distance, in addiction. It also might make you sick. Sometimes our consequences for living in dysregulated nervous systems aren't always necessarily happening in our relationships. Sometimes they are, don't get me wrong, but sometimes they are physically polluting our body. And if that's not motivation enough for us to just lean into learning a little bit more about the biosphere we're living in and what is going on internally, I don't know what is. So what happens is that we experience an activation, we think about it, we process it through our brains, we get into our action to push down the feeling. So it means that the feelings are happening last, if at all. Now, I personally do not think anyone can outrun their feelings. And I think that we are programmed to heal. So that means that those feelings are going to keep knocking at your door. And I know this has happened to me. It's probably happened to some of you. Sometimes it's like a tap on your shoulder, a tap, 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 and then it's a 2x4 across your face. And sometimes it's a Mack truck. So I do not believe that avoidance is a sustainable way of outrunning our feelings because I've never seen an avoidant attachment or anything outrun their feelings or their lessons in this life. So in that think, feel, do model, what happens is we suppress our feelings. Sadness, grief, longing, fear, needs, desires, all get suppressed. And let me be clear, it's not because they don't exist, but because accessing them once felt so overwhelming and unsafe. Living in our body never felt safe. It felt overwhelming. So in an avoidant attachment wound, we learned if I don't feel it, I don't lose control. So working on healing an avoidant attachment doesn't mean abandoning your logic. My goodness, if you guys didn't listen to the past episode, in that anxious attachment, logic is the last thing that's happening. We need logic, right? And especially when we have access to this type of work where we have tools and resources and things that we can use in our repertoire of logic. It means inserting feelings back into the process. Personally, I believe that we have more wisdom in our body than we do in our brain. Whenever I have people that come in with high IQs that are really secure in their intellectual abilities, Can you imagine having a high IQ and a high EQ? Like, you are looking at someone who, if I took a math class tomorrow, I mean, Lord in heaven, it wouldn't be good. And yet, when it comes to the domain of feelings, I would assume I'm off the charts as far as intelligence goes, right? So what we want ultimately is an integration of both. When I swan dive into my feelings, I am no good to myself and others. When I swan dive only into my thoughts, I'm of no good to myself or others either. I mean, there are studies that show, like, I think over 90% of our thoughts aren't true. So what we want to do is we want to integrate what we're thinking and feeling. So if I haven't mentioned it yet, I have had this beautiful experience of my client base being about half men, half women since I've started, which is surprising and sometimes unlikely, because a lot of times, women come into this work and then they'll bring their partners in sometimes as a result. In my work, that is not how it's gone. It has been men on their own coming into this work. Now, generally speaking, because this is so nuanced and not black and white, a lot of times women tend to have more of an anxious attachment and men tend to have more of an avoidant attachment. And that would be because of the origin wounds we experienced growing up. So I've had avoidant women, again, me being one of them. I have had a lot of men who identify as having a default avoidant attachment style. And the work is always about dropping them into their body and staying 1 minute longer. It's not that you have to have this huge capacity for intimacy and closeness. It's that we can stay in it 1 minute longer and 1 minute longer. And when we traverse and go into our body and we start to learn, we don't get eaten alive. It's not a bottomless pit of emotions. You start to develop emotional self-esteem, because there is no one who gets away in this work from having to walk straight up to the emotions that we felt powerless in at some point in our life or growing up. And we don't have to look it in the face and take our power back from it. Anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, ambivalent attachment, that's what we're doing. So if you can go into your body and we can get the intellect from our feelings, because our feelings are so intelligent. And I'm telling you guys, your nervous system is not wrong. I cannot wait until we get through this series and I start talking to you about emotional allergies and how intelligent our system is in our body that is connected to something that maybe created this whole thing. We can develop a trust in our feelings, a trust in our body, and 1 minute longer at a time that we can manage these, that we can survive it, and that no feeling is more powerful than you are. So if we can integrate what we're thinking and feeling, if we can stay in our body a little bit longer and not only access the intelligence of our brains, but we can access the intelligence of our nervous system and our feelings, then we get to implement a pause, right? So we think something, it comes through our brain, we pause. Remember, biggest and best mental health intervention of all time. We drop into our body, even if it's for 1 minute longer. We get the intel from our emotions. What is that emotion? What am I feeling? What is it communicating as far as what need is behind this emotion? And then we can choose a healthier action. So guess what? You still get to analyze. You still get to pause. You still get to value your autonomy. But now you can ask and get curious. What am I feeling? What am I afraid will happen? What do I need? Is the threat in my environment? Is the threat in the story I'm telling myself? Because what ends up happening when we lean into this level of understanding in our nervous system is your avoidant attachment wound is an alarm. It is always letting you know enmeshment, engulfment, overwhelm is in your environment or it's in the story you're telling yourself. There are a lot of people out there that are afraid of commitment, and that is a story they're telling themselves. And there's a lot of people that come into me and they are engulfed in their relationship because there is not appropriate boundaries between their anxious partner and them. That is doable. But it ends up allowing you to choose your response. Now we're back to agency instead of defaulting to distance, space, and isolation in your relationships. So I can't talk about avoidant attachment without bringing in anxious attachment, because guess what? People who have a default anxious attachment and people who have an avoidant default attachment tend to get in relationship with each other. They are drawn to each other, not by accident, you guys, by familiarity. It's because we are unconsciously drawn to the same energy that wounded us. So if you have an anxious attachment wound and you have a partner who is unavailable and there's emotional neglect going on, somewhere in you, an unconscious part of you sniffed that out as a means to have a corrective experience. And we've talked about this before. You can't have a corrective experience with the same energy that wounded you. You just can't. Now, if somebody tends to lean into an avoidant attachment and they're getting help for it, that's totally different. They're working on it, totally different. But we are drawn to the same energy that wounded us. If you are somebody who identifies with having an avoidant attachment, it means that you had a lack of boundaries in your environment growing up, in your relationships, and you might be drawn to women or men who are controlling, engulfing, don't have appropriate boundaries. And that is what we call the toxic tango in this work. And as you can see, if you kind of compare these two based off the last two episodes in this podcast, one person is feeling first. The person with the anxious attachment is feeling first. The person with the avoidant attachment is feeling last. One person with the anxious attachment is moving towards conflict in order to resolve it. And the other person is moving away from conflict to regulate it. One person is fighting for connection. The other person is protecting their autonomy. One person is craving intimacy. The other is fearing being engulfed by it. One person says, come closer and has this big capacity. The other person doesn't have the same capacity and needs space. The anxious partner is fearing abandonment. The avoidant partner is fearing losing themselves in the connection. The more one partner reaches, the more the other person retreats. The more one partner pursues, the more the other person shuts down. So anxious attachment abandons the self to preserve connection. Avoidant attachment abandons connection to preserve the self. Secure attachment learns how to do both. Connection and autonomy, closeness and space. I'm a huge fan of healthy connection in relationships, healthy disconnection. Healthy disconnection looks like autonomy, agency, having your own life, your own friends, your own interests, your own hobbies. That is healthy. When both partners begin to heal, the toxic tango turns into something else. Not a chase, not a retreat, not a power dynamic battle, but a relationship where both people can feel safe enough to stay. So remember, you are not your behavior. You are not your trauma responses, and you are not your attachment style. So if you have an avoidant attachment style, it doesn't mean who you are is cold. Who you are is someone who's not good at relationships or commitment. It does mean that you adapted. It means that you used those things as a means to survive. And the work is not about letting go of your independence. The work is learning that connection doesn't have to cost you yourself. So if this episode resonated with you, or maybe you know someone who tends to default or lean more into an avoidant attachment, send it to them. I know that when I first learned about attachment, it felt like somebody had a camera on me. Like, wait a minute, this isn't just me. These are behavioral patterns. So I hope that this was helpful. Next week, we're going to talk about an ambivalent attachment. So my invitation to you today and for last week is just to kind of lean into learning and building awareness about these attachment styles. Know that there's definitely nuance. Know that if it has sparked something in you or feels extremely activating, that is probably a sign from your nervous system that you need more help and support in learning about these things. There are books, there are wonderful professionals out there that specifically have trainings and expertise in attachment style. I recommend you diving in even more deeply. I have a plan here to kind of extend my services in the near future where maybe I'll be able to do some groups or some more workshops. So keep that in mind. That's coming. But think about these two attachment styles. Let it kind of marinate with you. Next week, we're going to talk about ambivalence, and let's keep going. As usual, thanks for being here. I'll see you next week. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for being here and for doing this work. If this episode resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Come connect with me over on TikTok at Robin Breckenridge or Instagram at Coach with Robin, where I share even more insights, tools, and conversations around boundaries, self-trust, relational healing, and so much more. And just a quick reminder, this podcast is for educational and personal growth purposes only. The insights and tools I share are based on my experience as a life and relationship coach and are meant for general guidance. Each person's story is unique, and the nuances of individual experiences can't always be addressed in this format. What's shared here may not be applicable to every situation, especially those involving abuse, oppression, severe mental illness, or systematic harm. If you or someone you know is in crisis, please seek support from a qualified mental health professional or emergency resources. Thank you for listening and for showing up for yourself in this way. Take care, and I'll see you next time.